Welcome to the 34th episode of A Change is a Chance. My name is Ryan Lowe, and my goal is to educate listeners, especially the youth, on some of the most pressing and polarizing issues in this world by interviewing different experts who can lead us into the charge for change. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Asian American hate has grown significantly, bringing mass media attention to Asian discrimination. However, hate towards Asians in this country started centuries ago. It's not new, and xenophobia repeats again and again. But much of Asian American history is not widely studied, and anti-Asian hate hasn't been widely discussed. To some white Americans, we're not quite American enough, but due to false ideas like the model minority myth, we aren't suffering enough to be BIPOC either. Because of this, it feels like we don't belong anywhere. Our history is left out, our experience is discounted by all, and we continue to face extreme discrimination. So how can we solve this? What we need is a storyteller, someone who lives forgotten voices, bridges our misunderstandings, and has the power to unite us all. Someone like Jon Osaki, the award-winning filmmaker and activist who has worked on many educational films regarding Asian American identity, history, and solidarity with other marginalized groups. His documentary films include Alternative Facts: The Lies of Executive Order 9066, which reveals the truth behind Japanese American incarceration during World War II, Not Your Model Minority, an exploration of how anti-Asian violence and the model minority myth have been used to divide us against other minorities, and finally, Reparations, my favorite, a story about African American and Asian American solidarity and both the history and future we hold together. Mr. Osaki is also the executive director of the Japanese Community Youth Council, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping San Francisco Bay Area youth of all races with their well-being, education, and enrichment. So clearly, Mr. Osaki has dedicated his life to telling these stories, and now he'll be teaching us too. So how are you doing, Mr. Osaki? This is the third time I've seen you in the past month.
That's right. And I am very pleased to be here and very pleased to meet you and glad that I am seeing you for the third time.
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So let's start pretty easy. What first inspired you to be a filmmaker?
Well, so, I had an interest in film for a long time, and um, because I was never formally trained and don't have any, education in that area, it was always kind of a hobby for me. But I think what I have been, though, pretty much all my life is a storyteller. So it was really a matter of figuring out, could my technical filmmaking skills kind of catch up with my storytelling? And so over, the process of a few years, I did a few, amateur type project, shorts and things like that, just to experiment. And groups started asking me to do short videos for events and things like that. But what really happened was in 2016, when this country was having a presidential election, that I really committed to making a professional documentary. And the reason why I decided to do that was during that campaign, there started to be comments again in this country that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was actually justified, right? And that we might have to revisit those types of measures because of Syrian refugees and other immigrants coming into this country. And so it was really at that point that I realized that, this narrative was becoming incredibly harmful and discounting a mistake that this country had already acknowledged in 1988. And so I felt like I needed to do something about it, and making a film was me doing something about it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I feel like a film, the storytelling can be more important than the film, like, or the filmmaking itself. And yeah, what you're saying about this, yes, history repeats itself. Okay, so from my perspective, your work educates and sparks these needed conversations as you were just talking about. So what do you most hope people walk out with when watching each of your films?
Well, I think for sure I want people to learn something new that they didn't know before. I want people to think something that maybe they hadn't thought of before. And I want there to be a willingness for people to talk about very difficult issues. Because I think one of the biggest challenges we have in this country right now is that people who disagree with each other are not willing to sit down and have a conversation and see if they could work through those disagreements and find common ground. People are not willing to do that. And that's why we have such a polarized society right now. And we don't, in my opinion, that does not allow for progress to be made. And the American people suffer because of it. And so for me, I'm trying to do what I can in my own ways to counter that and to promote more dialogue and more discussion and more understanding about groups who may not know that much about each other.
Well, I want you to know that after watching Alternative Facts with my family at your screening, I learned a ton of new things, and we did have those important discussions. We were actually talking about it for a few days after. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So, my next question, do you identify as an Asian American or Japanese American or both or neither? And what effect do these identity labels have on the world?
Well, I definitely identify as both. I mean, certainly, both my mother and father were Japanese American. I'm a what is referred to as a sansei or a third generation Japanese American. So I have a very strong affinity for that identity. But I also see the value in identifying myself as an Asian American because I believe that that allows for greater representation and that allows for communities who may not be as vocal or may not have as much political power to coalesce and work together, right, to have a voice in this country. So I very much do appreciate being part of that narrative and being part of really building power, amongst our communities to have a voice because I think, to your point in having these conversations, so often Asian Americans could get left out of conversations of communities of color.
Yeah.
We are marginalized by, the dominant white society. And so it is really important for us to have a voice, to have a place in this country, and to really, demand our place in this country.
And I just want to bring something up. A counterpoint to that idea of Asian American embodying everyone, if it does embody everyone, if are we just grouping everyone into this one group called Asian American when all these other cultures are to be found? And is that a bad thing we should be worried about?
So I think it's all about context and
Yeah.
the environment that you apply sort of a more comprehensive view of the Asian American community. To me, it's really about political power, right? And that coming together for issues that affect all of us. And I do think that there's a role and there's power, right, in marshaling all of our collective political capital as communities. Like, I think there's a lot to be said for that. Now, having said that, it's not applicable in every situation. And it is important for individual communities to be recognized and for their cultures to be appreciated and learned about and as part of the American fabric. So I think that it's not something that makes sense to apply in every situation. It shouldn't be a catch-all, but it certainly has a specific role that I think can be helpful to all Asian Americans.
Yeah, you're very right. And going back to political power, that is kind of, the thing that pulls everything together. Yeah. Okay, so when my parents went to university in the 1990s, they studied the model minority myth as it was a silencing reality that they dealt with and fought against daily. 30 years later, I don't think the stereotype has been shattered at all, even though there are more of us holding public offices and higher profile roles and aligning with the work of other people of color. But what's your take on all of this?
Well, it hasn't gone away because it is a very intentional and successful practice of white supremacy. They want this narrative to proliferate. And the reason why they want it to proliferate is that it goes back to this idea of what communities of color should be like, what they want communities of color to be like, and that is hardworking, doesn't complain, and that's kind of the narrative, right? That white supremacists in this country want communities of color to fall within. And so by labeling Asian Americans in connection with the model minority myth, it creates this situation where you're lifting up one community and saying, this is how you should act. And it, by virtue of that, is also being critical of other communities who do speak out, right? Who are very vocal about their rights and their civil liberties and things that they feel like have not been addressed by this country, right? So it's in some ways a direct rebuke of communities of color who have taken that approach. And so it's continued to stay around because it is helpful to the dominant white culture in this country. And so I think that the more we can counter that, the more that we can build alliances with other communities of color and support their issues. And I think it's so important that, and I know it's hard to take this approach, but it's something that I've lived by, is that in order to really make progress in addressing systemic racism in this country, communities of color can not only advocate for themselves, they need to be willing to advocate for each other. And that is really the only way that we're going to build power and we're going to counter this model minority narrative.
Yeah. So you would say then that solidarity is the key to fixing this.
Solidarity, but also um, making sure that as a community we are not used, right, to uphold a white supremacist agenda, because that has happened many, many times over the years. And I think we as a community have to be very cautious about that and understand when that's happening and be, very intentional about making sure that we are speaking on behalf of all communities of color and not just our own.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we do address these things. And getting exploited the way the Asian community has is kind of major concern for the group as a whole. So I read the book Minority Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, and there's a line she said that struck me very hard. She said, "When I hear people say Asians are next in line to be white, I replace the word white with disappear. Asians are next in line to disappear." I relate to this. We are not the image of Americans when you hear that word, yet we are not counted as BIPOC due to the overgeneralization metrics of Asian American well-being as a whole. So how do you interpret her statement? Do you feel that Asian Americans are not being seen and heard? And if so, what can we do? What can Asian Americans and not Asian Americans do to fix this?
Well, I can certainly understand why a lot of people would feel that way. And my response to that would be is I think each of us have to take a critical look at the degree to which we are trying to assimilate towards whiteness in this country. Are we, by virtue of how we act and what we value and what we uphold, are we supporting that narrative that the way to success in this country is by assimilating towards whiteness, or by how we conduct ourselves and by what we value, are we pursuing values that are counter to that, right? That are counter to my culture and what I find important and how I think about having this society that lifts up everybody. And it's not easy to do, right? I just want to be honest about that, right? Like it's not easy to take that approach. But I think that the more individuals who can and are willing to, right, the more we'll find a place in this country because there is truth in the fact that as much as we want to assimilate towards whiteness, we're never going to be white,
Yeah.
right? Like that's just the bottom line. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that truly the path towards prosperity in this country? Or is there a different way, right? Is there a way that we find our place within communities of color and build power that way? So I think each of us have to think, and again, I want to just be honest about the fact that most of us have been conditioned to think that assimilation is the way to be successful in this country. And for many Asian American communities, like my parents' generation, assimilation was critical for survival,
Yeah.
right? Like you had to do that because you were such a target of hate in this country. So I understand why so many have gravitated towards that path, but I feel like today is a new day. And I think that each of us can ask ourselves what should be the path going forward.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. My mom's an immigrant, and we discuss this all the time. She talks about her stories of getting bullied
Mhm.
till she started trying to assimilate, because it was
Right.
survival. You're completely right.
Absolutely.
And how would you say, like, I know you just said it's important to do it, but how would you say we can maybe shift that mentality from assimilation to maybe creating our own culture within this country?
Well, I think that there are, strength in numbers, right? So I think creating communities, whether they be geographic communities, ethnic communities, are really important, right? Like that's one way that we marshal like a critical mass of energy and identities. And so I'm very much a believer in building community. And then from there, I think it's important to explore where there's common ground with other communities, right? Like what can we celebrate and work on together and come together to support each other? Where are those areas? And again, I want to be very clear that the approach of white supremacy is in this country is that people who uphold that agenda do not want that to happen. They do not want communities of color to come together because it does not support their agenda. And so along the way, there's going to be all these different ways in which we get pitted against each other. And I think we just have to be mindful of that. And to me, it always comes down to relationships. And if we can find ways to build relationships with other communities, then when there are very intentional efforts to pit our communities against each other, we can work through those situations, right? We can have dialogue. We can talk through and have a greater understanding of each other's perspectives instead of just retreating, right, into our own corners and not interacting anymore.
Yeah, it does seem like solidarity is the key. It is. So during COVID, as I was talking about earlier, anti-Asian hate grew a lot, and I personally experienced some. What do you believe is the key to dismantling this, and what will it take for Asians not to be seen as outsiders within this country, to everyone?
Well, I think, something that I'm personally involved in is one of the keys is that people need to know our story, need to know that we helped build the railroads and help the farming industry. And there's all these different ways that Asian Americans have made contributions to this country, both historically and today. And that we've been around for, you know, centuries. and that there have been very intentional efforts to keep us out and to control us, to tell us what we could own and couldn't own, where we could live and couldn't live. And we've had to struggle through all of that. And again, the way part of what the challenge is that to this, for many, while they are trying to just survive in this country, right, they could not be outspoken about that, right? They had to assimilate to survive. And so many of those stories people don't know. And so I know that myself, many other communities around the country want to increase the inclusion of Asian American studies content in K through 12 schools and private schools and universities, and to really make that part of the experience that all students receive. Because as much as, us Asian Americans want to learn our own history, it's even more important for other people to learn it,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? And that the more understanding that people have about how long we've been here and the contributions we made, there are many who believe that that is one of the ways in which we're going to, hopefully diffuse future waves of anti-Asian hate.
And this method of education you're talking about, how can the youth, people like me, really get involved with this?
Well, I think you can go to your teachers and you could demand, well, diplomatically, I don't want to get you in trouble, but you could, ask for more Asian American content in your classrooms, right? Ensure that there's representation in history classes, right? In social studies classes and history and in political science classes, and that those issues are also included in the material covered in your classrooms. And I think all students can be vocal about that. And it's been my experience that when students come together and raise their voices and make recommendations about the content that they feel is important for not only them to learn, but for their peers to learn, that people listen.
Okay, that's really good advice. Okay, so finally, and I'm sorry, you have answered this question in front of me multiple times already from our other meetings. What's next for you, Mr. Osaki?
So I'm currently working on a project about the impact that Asian American Studies has had on various communities around the country, as well as the current movement to increase Asian American Studies content into different school systems around the country. So we're documenting both the origins of Asian American Studies that started from student strikes at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State to modern day movements where young people, just like yourself, are advocating for more content and for the inclusion of this material into like core curriculum. And that's actually happening all over the country. And it's really amazing to see. And so that's what we're documenting through our film. It's called Making Waves, The Rise of Asian America. And so what we hope is that this could be a catalyst for bolstering this movement, right? And getting more people talking about the content that should be provided in every classroom.
I don't want to spoil anything, but could you give us a small preview of like the themes you found so far in filming?
Sure. I mean, I will tell you that one of the most compelling storylines that we found was groups of students in Texas, right? Like in Texas high schools, there's never been an Asian American Studies course, right?
Wow.
Ever. And so because of the advocacy of students in that area, they were able to get the state school board to sanction the piloting of the very first Asian American Studies class in high school in Texas history. So
Wow.
those are the kinds of stories that we'll be covering in this film.
That's really great. Yeah, I'm so excited. When is that going to come out, if you know?
Well, so probably at this point, we're thinking fall, maybe fall of this year or early in 2025.
Nice. Okay, that sounds really great. Okay, well, thank you so much for this conversation, Mr. Osaki. As an Asian American, I've been really invested in learning about our history and identity, and what you've talked about is so crucial. Solidarity, education, all of it. I believe everyone needs to understand our story and all the other marginalized groups too, just as you've been talking about. So please keep telling these stories around the nation, as I know you will. And I look forward to seeing you making waves, the rise of Asian America. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and keep doing what you're doing as well.
I will. Yeah, so that's it for the 34th episode of A Change is a Chance. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much, Mr. Osaki.
Thank you. Take care.